And here we begin the world again. Beginning of the history of our people, which is, of course, the matter of this book, the book of the Torah, and the history that begins with the famous words, Lech Lecha. And God said to Avram, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha, me'artzecha, mi'moladetzecha, mi'beit avicha. God said to Avram, Lech Lecha. How are we to translate that? Get going. Right, that's how the Ramban translates it. I'll fill that in a moment. What is that odd word, lecha? Go, that would have been enough. Go, leave. Leave the house of your travel. From your land, from your neighborhood, and from the house of your father, your more intimate neighborhood. So now we know very clearly what he has to leave behind. He has to leave behind all the envelopes of his being, everything that has held him and given him an identity up to now. Where is he to go to? And there is the sting. El haaretz asher areka. Now, when someone is going to travel, obviously the piece of information that he needs to have, he or she, is where he is going. Where he's leaving, he knows very well. I know where I am, I hope. But where am I going? But here God tells him in great detail where he is, what you have to leave behind. The real work is now detachment, in a way. Detachment, and then go to the land which I will show you. El haaretz asher areka. These are famous words, much written about. And I want to take them at their most, at their most visceral. What is God really saying to Abraham at this moment? He is saying, I want you to go, but I'm not telling you where to go. That is, it's not just that he's a little vague about the destination. He's actually putting it in such a way that he is telling Avram something. He's not just not telling. He's telling him, I'm not telling you. Yeah? As the children say something, I'm not telling you. Yeah? In other words, mystery, No, it's not a joke in this case, because it's a man's life that we're talking about here. And it's the first time God has spoken to him. Out of the blue somewhere comes the voice of God. Now, we know, because we've already read last week's parsha, that we knew about Avram already, before the Lech Lecha. Avram was already introduced to us right at the end of last week, where we have a reference to his father, Avram's father Terach, who took his family and left his home of origin, Ur Kasdim, and started traveling towards Eretz Canaan. That's an important bit of information. Only he didn't complete the journey. He stopped midway. He stopped somewhere in a place called Haran. And that's where they settled down. So when God then later speaks to Avram and tells him, go, you might well think that Avram might well have thought, I'm being asked to complete the journey that my father began. That makes a lot of sense. But God gives the information in such a way as the kind of tantalizing way of telling it. So to say, I'm emphasizing what you have to leave, and I'm not telling you where you're going to go, so don't jump to conclusions. If you think it's Eretz Canaan, well, I wouldn't depend on it, in a sense. Right? What you are to do now is travel free, open-ended. El haaretz asher areka, to the land which I will show you. In the end, that I will show you. I won't tell you, but somehow you will be confronted with the land. You'll see that this is the land. If you look at Rashi, in number 1 on your page, Rashi has a full commentary on the whole verse, but I'm just looking at the last part, at the end of number 1, at this point. El haaretz asher areka, to the land which I will show you. And here is Rashi, who is the prime commentary on the text. He is the one we look at first, and he is giving us here a straightforward interpretation of the words, and he says very simply, God did not reveal to him the land right away. So he's emphasizing the fact that God withholds information, that he didn't reveal the essential information that you might have thought that that's what he needs. Why didn't he? And then there is a rather strange, not so obvious explanation. What's the reason for withholding information here? Kedei lechabeva be'einav, to make it chaviv in his eyes. Chaviv, the best translation that I know really is dear, the lovely English word dear. To make it dear in his eyes, like a child is dear, chaviv. To make what dear in his eyes? To make precious, we could say, but it's really not precious, it's dear. It's not valuable, it's what? What's this word? In order to make the land, that is, right? His destination, precious in his eyes. Now, is it going to make it more beloved to him, the fact that he has to kind of fish around in reality? He's going to have to wander and from one place to the other for who knows how long before he finally gets there without any idea of where he's going. You might say that's really just torment. You know, God is tormenting Abraham. He's making him travel, sight unseen, without any idea of where he's going. According to one midrash, a very emotional one, a very vivid one, people, his contemporaries, have heard about him. He has become a byword, and a byword for madness. Tir'u mishugazeh. Look at this crazy person. Have you ever seen a person who travels without any idea of where he's going? And it won't do just to say that he is to be a nomad. That's a nice way of sort of taming the whole situation. There are nomads, and you can live like that. It's by the phenomenon of the ancient Near East and of the present day. And it's not like that. A nomad has a name to it. If you know if you're a nomad. Usually you have a whole group around you. It's part of a certain culture. This is something else. This is being cut off from any kind of culture, from any naming, not even the name of your destination. You don't know. And in the course of his travels, or at some point later, actually, we know that Avram will change his name. That's just one more little piece of information, just another mosaic piece to put in place here. That he will change his name. What will make him change his name? What will have that transformative effect on him? Have a look now at the beginning of Rashi, in the same passage, number 1, on the word Lech Lecha. And really what I want to talk about this evening is just that one word. When it comes right down to it, we're going to have a cascade of material, which I hope you'll find provocative and interesting. But really, it's all about one word. It's really about the mystery of this word Lecha. What does that mean? Now, when I said before that Ramban agrees with you, was it you who said that Lech Lecha just means get going? Not just go, but a kind of swing to it, a kind of energy to it. Ramban says, he puts it a little differently, but he says effectively the same thing. He says, don't worry about the word Lecha. There's piles of midrash that worry about the word Lecha. That's what we're going to be sharing this evening. And Ramban says it's unnecessary effort. It's overkill. The word Lecha is a stylistic feature of Hebrew style. Yeah? You find it in Shir HaShirim, Lech Lecha, Lechi Lecha, Lechi Lach. Yeah? It's just a way, it's a feature that gives energy to the verb. Go, not just go, but get going. That's all it is. Rashi, by contrast, in the wake of the Midrash, and we're starting with Rashi, but we'll move backwards into the Midrash, it says, Letovat, Lehanatcha u letovatcha. It's a very famous unpacking of the word Lecha. For your benefit and for your good. That is, it's all about you. It's all about you, and it's all about good things coming to you. And I assure you, God is saying to Avram, that although it's not easy, this journey, you will get reward way beyond expectation for it. And there are many blessings that follow in the text. I will bless you, and those who bless you shall be blessed. Yeah, and children. How does Rashi address it here? Very succinctly. He says, V'sham escha l'goy gadol. one of the blessings is, I'll make you into a great nation. So Rashi says, there I'll make you into a great nation. When you get to that destination, which I'm not telling you, you will then become fertile, you'll have a great nation, where here you will remain without children. The other piece of information we know already about Avram before Lech Lecha, from last week's parsha, at the end, we hear the second piece of information is that Avram's wife, Sarai, is infertile. She can't have children. It's put very definitely. Ein lavalad. She doesn't have the wherewithal to have children. So it's an extreme case of infertility. And this is the background information we have on Avram. And God says to him, yes, here. But it's really worth your while to undertake this journey, because there you will. So it's put very much in terms of here and there. And the there is left mysterious, and the journey is just to get there. And the point is just to get to the place where you'll have all the blessings. I want to come in at another point in Rashi here, and rather than cover the whole thing, because we have a journey in front of us. In the middle of the passage there, v'heyeh bracha. You'll have all kinds of blessings, a good reputation, good financial, you'll be in a good financial situation, I'll make you rich, I'll make you full of blessings of every kind. And here is the culminating blessing. V'heyeh bracha. This is very beautiful, I think. Heyeh bracha is you will be a blessing. You will not just be blessed, which everyone wants, of course. Who doesn't want blessing? But it'll go much further and deeper than that. This is a more important moment than that. It's not just a moment of blessing. It's a moment in which you will acquire the ability to give blessing to others. And it's put a little technically here, as if it be in your power to give blessing. Up to now, it's only been in my power to give blessing, in my hand, God says. It's a divine power to give blessing. I blessed Adam, I blessed Noach, and I'm blessing you. Right? And you get it in the text of the Torah. Vayivarech Hashem. God blessed these people. And it's obviously meaningful, that words can do something. Words of blessing. But now is something of a different order that Avram is being blessed with. That you will become a blessing to others, which means here, technically, you will have the power meaningfully to bless other people. But what I understand by it, putting it a little differently, is that you yourself will become a source of blessing. That there is something about you which will, in the future, not yet. And when you get there, you will become someone whom people are blessed through contact with, that you will have the power to. That's something else entirely. I mean, that, what a summary of a life that would be. It's something almost too much to say very seriously, that you have been a source of blessing. And what's said here then is what's dangling now in front of Avram, not just that he'll have good things in his life, but a more inward spiritual blessing, which is that he will acquire a kind of dynamic in his inner world. His inner world will become dynamic, will become powerful, so that it can move outwards. It can have an effect on the world. Now, with this, we have a sense that Avram is being promised blessing mostly when he comes to his destination, there, not here. Think now of what the Zohar has to say. What is Lecha? Quite different, really. What's Lecha? Letikuncha ulegormecha. For the correcting, repairing of you. Tikkun, the making whole of you, something like that. Tikkun is hard to translate, but I think people probably know the word, yes? Shviras HaKelim, we talked about it last week, the broken vessels, and then the task of each person to try to get some fragments together and do some measure of repair in the world, on the tragic reality of the world, the broken reality of the world. So this will be for the repair of you. I didn't know I needed repair. That's a shocking moment in a way. Not too shocking, because God is saying, you know what I mean. Everyone knows what that means. That this will be the making of you, and this will be the gormecha, even more, legrom. This will bring you into being, as if you don't properly exist yet. Now, I thought I had a perfectly decent life till now, and then God comes and tells me, actually, it hasn't even begun. I want you to leave behind your idea of a good life now, and in a way, go open-ended out into the world where you will become. Never mind here that you will get blessings, that all kinds of good things will happen to you, but that you will be transformed. Now that's a more inward. The Zohar is going straight for the soul. Is not interested in the accidents of the body, except that you can't become a new person and a whole person without the body. Right? The body is an essential part of the crisis of being a human being. Of the problem of being a human being. And Avraham in the Zohar, in Kabbalah, is particularly associated with the embodied soul. That he is the soul who has to go through all kinds of very physical adventures and confrontations in order to become himself, in order to become Avraham. And at that point, his name is changed. And God says to him, Hayeh Tamim. God's still saying to him at that point, later on, at the end of the Parsha, chapter 17, Hitalech lefanai v'heyeh tamim. Walk in front of me, keep walking, you've arrived in Eretz Israel. But just keep walking in front of me, and clearly that means a spiritual movement, and become whole. So it's not as if he's achieved wholeness, it seems. It's not wholeness, it's a movement of integration in himself. That starts with Lech Lecha, starts with the promise of Lech Lecha, and has everything to do with the journey, rather than with the arrival. It has to do with the process of traveling. There's something about the process of traveling, as it's imagined in the Midrash, as we're going to see the amazing images that are used, that does something to a person. Now, it's not only present-day young people who are off to India to discover themselves or other places. It's the very idea that the travails of travel, if I can play with words, it's not even a play, it's actually the same root, it's the same background, travailler in French. It's the work of travel, which is painful in many ways because there is always something unknown about travel. I think it really comes down to that. It needn't be physically so painful, so rigorous these days as it well, I will take that back. It can be quite physically wearing. But it's more the sense of unknownness. You think you've got it all under control. You've planned everything, the schedule, everything to the last detail. And then what do you know? This plane is late, and so how are you going to catch the connection? And all your plans are... And this is a commonplace of travel. It also means, is from the word to give birth, right, in English, yeah? Travail, the idea somewhere of labor pains. Right? Bringing something new into being is one of the characteristics, one of the fantasies, let's say, of travel. Travel, that's the wish in some way, that you will discover things about yourself. That's self-discovery as travel. The Zohar here puts it in its most basic vocabulary. Ramban, if we have a look now to the side, before we focus in on the Midrashic traditions. Are people hot? Yeah. I did ask them to, is the air conditioning on? It is actually, yes. Yeah. If someone is really distressed and wants to, please go down and see if they can do something. Number two, Ramban. El haaretz asher areka. And I'm going to combine this with number 4, which is a longer passage in Ramban. I'm going to try and just pick out one or two things. To the land which I will show you. Ramban is not concerned to ask here what's the meaning of the word lecha and why this open-ended travel. But he simply describes what it was like for Avram and makes us realize the pathos of Avram's situation. What does it mean to do what God told him to do? Haya noded v'holech, right? It's very, very felt. He was wandering constantly. Now that word wandering, noded, is like a vagrant. That is, he has no sense of purpose. He is not moving towards an end. He has no idea if he's going the wrong way, the right way. It's crazy. Have you seen this crazy person? By the way, the English word crazy, like the Hebrew word meshuga, comes from the idea of zigzagging around without clear purpose. Right? The word crazy is like a crazed pavement. You know what I mean by crazed pavement? You know, where the lines are all zigzag. And the word meshuga, shogea, also means just to wander aimlessly. Now there's something you might say soul-destroying about that. But God says, paradoxically to Avram, ve'escha legoy gadol. Through this journey, I will create you anew, bria chadasha. I will create you anew, that's ve'escha. I will create you, not just I'll make you into a great nation, but I will make you. You will be made by this journey. And the journey is a journey of noded v'holech. You remember who was cursed with being a wanderer? Cain, yes? Navanad. There, it's an unequivocal curse. No, who wants that? It's a kind of homeless, let's say, homeless situation, amplified. And this is what he was doing from one nation to the other, from one kingdom to the other, till he arrived in Eretz Canaan. And then God said to him, to your seed am I giving this land. And that's the moment of arrival, where Avram knows that God has shown him that he's arrived at that moment. How long does it take in the Torah for Avram to get there? It's about 7 verses. Yeah? Pasuk Zayin, in this chapter, he arrives. So it's really cut short. For Ramban, it could have been any length of time. He wants you to think that it might have, we don't know, but it might have been years that he was traveling. To get a real sense of what he's confronted with here. What is this journey? And then at the end, I want to come in at the end there, we know also what this journey was for Avram by the way he talks about it himself later. He has a comment to make himself about these years of his life, this period of his life. And that happens when he's talking to Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, where he has one of those unfortunate wife-sister debacles. Yeah? And there he tells the king, he has to sort of apologize for not making it clear that his sister is really his wife, and so on. So he says, from the beginning, when God made me wander, hit'uoti ha'elokim, in the plural, God, the God of plurality, of not clarity, made me wander from the house of my father. The period of my wanderings, at that time, I agreed with my wife that this is what I would say. But the main point here in Ramban is that word lit'ot, with a taf, to wander all over the place, which clearly represents, and in case you don't understand, I say clearly, in case you don't understand that root, ta'a, with a taf, Ramban is helpful here. And he says, because huaya to'eh kase oved. That's a wonderful piece of interpretation. What is Ramban doing? He was wandering like a lost lamb. So on one level, he's simply giving you the feeling of the pathos of what wandering is. Wandering is like a lost lamb. So kind of laying on the pathos. But he's doing something more precise. He's quoting from the end of Tehillim. He's quoting from the book of Psalms, where the psalmist cries out to God poignantly, Ta'iti kase oved. I've been wandering like a lost lamb. Bakesh avdecha. Seek out your servant. Please find your servant. You look for me, I can't look for you. You're in charge of the Google map, and I am just a lost lamb who's just blundering around all over the place. Now, Ramban is deliberately making that association. That is, David's words are being put in Avram's mouth, as it were, so that you understand the condition of Avram. The condition of Avram is a kind of disoriented, meaningless, and anxious condition. It's not a joke at all. And the anxiety I'm talking about here, if I can add something, is really what I want to emphasize in our discussion now. it's not so jolly, to go on a journey to India with your backpack and good company, and you may have some moments there, but on the whole it's fun. This was not fun. This was anxious, because what Avram is doing is leaving behind his identity, and he's in a transitional state where he has no other identity yet. And he's confronting situations without a clear core of himself. There's a book by Herbert Fingeret called The Self in Transformation. And he's interested in precisely experiences of this kind. The kind of challenge that one has when one goes into therapy, let's say. When one goes for any life-changing process of one kind. Or it can be a religious process, it can be an existential process. But what characterizes these processes for Fingeret is the crisis of anxiety. That there is an anxiety which means ego disorganization, ego fragmentation. Ego is the clear sense of meaning. My ego is that which is associated with my control of my life in terms of a certain sense of meaning, so that I can navigate my life rather firmly. But when the ego breaks apart, because the old life is no longer there, and I don't know yet where I am, then what I have clearly is anxiety, not just as a feeling, and everyone knows, I suppose, or I hope not too much, what that feeling is. It's one of the most difficult feelings, I think, that a human being can have. Every now and then one gets reminded of what that means. And it's a feeling of not knowing how to put things together. I don't know where is myself in all this. You don't quite know. The world is incoherent. And it's a demoralizing experience, he says, which people in therapy must go through. That is, there has to be a moment in which a person really realizes, if he didn't realize from the beginning, what brought him into therapy after all, is that things are not right the way they are. There's something wrong here, and there has to be some change, and I don't see what change will do it. It isn't immediately obvious what I need to become. I don't see it as a clear image in front of me. And so here I am, I'm left here, Ela Aretz Asher Areka, traveling, hoping somewhere in this disoriented state to remoralize oneself. One invests now in trying to put oneself together in a different way, in a better way. Now, it sounds very concrete the way I put it now, take oneself apart, but there is something about that feeling, about that. Ramban, if you look at the second passage in number 4, finds this whole story of Lech Lecha. He doesn't mince his words. He says he doesn't see any meaning to this whole story. Hinei zot parsha lo be'ara kol ha'inyan. Ki ma ta'am? What's the point? What's the meaning? I don't understand this. What's the meaning that God should tell a person, physically leave your background, leave your country, and make that the cause of blessings? It's not a spiritual challenge, he says. It's not that God tells him in a spiritual tone, hitalech lefanai v'hayeh tamim, walk in front of me and be whole. God will say that eventually, at the end of the parasha. But at the beginning, it sounds purely concrete. Just get up and travel. And the only thing, I would say, that is an indication that it's more than that it's not just, a tour, that he's going on a travel thing, is that word lecha. Travel, in some way, it's all about you. It's not about, it's not about just moving. It's an inward process of some kind. So Ramban is very dissatisfied with this. He says that doesn't make spiritual sense. And he also complains, why is Avram chosen? Which is it's a classic question. Of all people in the world, why did God choose Avram to become this bearer of a great destiny, to found a people of this kind? We don't know anything spectacular about Avram at this early moment of his life from the Torah. Nothing at all, not even Sadiq Tamim. He's not even given the compliment that Noach was given, that he was a perfectly righteous man. Nothing. So why? And by way of answer, and I don't want to take too long on this, he simply says this. He says, we have to remember there's something that's not written in the Torah, a midrash, a famous midrash, which gives us the early life of Avram and gives us the sense that Avram actually was a person who was ready to give up his life for his self-developed belief in God. That in some way he broke his father's idols, according to this midrash, as I'm sure you're all familiar with it. I'll just say it very briefly. His father was a merchant of idols, and he broke his father's idols, and his father is enraged and brings him to court with the king, Nimrod, who condemns him to death in a fiery furnace. And he is willing to go to his death. He won't recant. Now, he's saved from the fire. And after that, there is a sense, we are helped by hearing that midrash is important. It helps us morally almost, to justify the choice of Avram. Oh, so he really was a special person. But one has to admit that that midrash is very unattached to the text in a way. You can't really find any indication of it in the text at all. And the interesting thing is that two of the greatest medieval thinkers about the Torah, who is Ramban and Rambam, both, have recourse to that midrash, that they bring it in as if it's essential, as if it's the spiritual biography of Avram we're talking about here. And it's repressed in the text. I'll use a psychoanalytic term. That it's not in the text, maybe for good reason, because that was pure terror. That was an unbearable experience for the person who was thrown in the fire. Right. I want to pick that up again next week. But the idea that a whole important part of Avram's biography is left out, as it were, of the story, which is really the way Ramban puts it. He has to find some explanation for that. And what he says has never particularly, I haven't found it so helpful. He says, well, the Torah doesn't like to go into theological consumer reports, kind of comparisons, what they believed and what we believe and what Avram didn't believe. That's not what the Torah does. That's his answer. That Avram experiences things rather than has theological thoughts in the Torah. That's Ramban. And notice the use of that midrash. He brings it in as if it's essential. If we look now at the Rambam, we're still doing our background scan before we close in on the midrash. The Rambam, in the next passage, number 5, famous passage in Hilchot Avodat Kochavim, begins very dramatically. This is not quite the beginning. Talking about this baby, this infant. As soon as this giant was weaned, that's Abraham, at the age of 3, he began l'shotet b'da'ato v'hu katan. It's a beautiful description. That even though he was small, he was still very young. He began to wander around in his mind. So in a way, he's an intellectual wanderer. But it turns out that he begins to think by day and night, it says. He is a philosopher. When you read through the whole passage, and I recommend that you do, it's really a very powerful passage, we get a sense that the Rambam thinks of Avram in the highest terms he knows, which are in the terms of the heroes of Greek philosophy. Aristotle, he asks the same question that Aristotle asked. And the question that preoccupies Avram as he starts thinking is, how can it be that this world keeps going, the spheres keep turning in the Ptolemaic view of the universe? The spheres keep turning without anything to turn them. So you'll say that each sphere is moved by the one beyond it. But what about the outer sphere? What moves that? So he moves from point to point in his thinking until he gets as far as he can. And then he says, so there must be a first mover. There must be beyond the moving spheres of the world, the changing worlds, there must be something out there that keeps things going. But he's thinking in cosmic terms. He's thinking in geocosmic terms. He's physically of what gives life and energy to the world. How does it, right? It's that kind of question, which of course has all kinds of implications as far as the meaning of life is. And so he comes to his conclusions. There must be a God there, and he arrives at the truth. And he thinks everybody else is just wrong. To'im. Right? It's very unequivocal. There's no political correctness about it. He's got the truth, everyone else is wrong, and he makes it his task to teach people, to teach them through dialogue. Mostly one-on-one, searching discussions. Plato, Socrates, who gets into trouble with the government because he's going around talking to people and subverting their conventional beliefs by question and answer, by narrowing things, by skepticism, moving through possibilities and realizing they don't work. It's purely a logical process. And he teaches people in this way, and then Socrates is executed. And on the same model, Avram is taken he's arrested and put into something, a bore or a kivshan ha'esh, something. And there he already again brings up that fiery furnace. He says, he just refers to it glancingly and says, yeah, he was really in trouble at a certain point. And then God saves him, and he goes on his journey. And all this in some way is, in a way, avoiding God's Lech Lecha. It's a way just giving it as the autonomous process of a philosopher who comes to the truth and is ready to give his life for the truth and spend his life afterwards gathering crowds of people around him. It's called Hanefesh Asher Asa. All the people who were attracted to him, and he would lecture brilliantly, and he would have these one-on-one debates that acquired souls, that made souls in other people. And then in the end he wrote books, and I'm really just cutting through it. He wrote books, so it's like that's the climax of an academic career. That's without that you can't be said to have succeeded. And the Rambam thinks that there really are books in existence that were written by Avraham. It's interesting. I don't know too much about it, but that much I have seen. And he teaches it to his son Yitzchak, Hodio. Now, the way the Rambam puts it, it's not just Greek philosophy. It's clear. He uses the Greek model as a way of evoking respect in the world, because everyone respects Greek philosophy in his time. That's the biggest. But it's clear that there are secrets here as well. It's not just information about how the world is put in motion, but there's much more to it in what he has to convey to the world. Still, it's very teleological, almost the sense that you learn until you know it, and when you know it, you teach it. Yes. Now, I don't know. I don't think even a school, any teacher can do that well. In some way, learning is infinite. One is constantly learning. Talmid Chacham, is someone who is constantly the Talmid of a Chacham. That is constantly growing. But with the Rambam, it seems to be very much that you acquire a certain amount of knowledge, a certain kind of knowledge, and then your only question is, how do I pass it on to other people? What is the best? It's a pedagogical question. How do I teach well? Rambam, in saying this, he's demystifying, in a way. Do you know that expression? Demystifying? He is, in a way, reducing the mystifying implications of the Midrashic traditions. He knows the Midrashic traditions very well. And as we saw, he can use it when he wants. But now we're going to turn and we're about halfway, and we're going to look now at a few Midrashim, the first ones, one of the early ones that in the beginning of Midrash Rabbah. And know what the Rambam is not taking into account. That he is telling the story in the way he did, in a historical, kind of concrete way, the history of an education, the history of, it's a Bildungsroman, we used to call it, yeah? A Bildungsroman is a history, is a novel about the education of the hero, how the hero comes to know what he needs to know in the world. And in this case, it's amplified by the hero becoming a teacher of other people. that he becomes an influence in the world. Let's look now at the first Midrash, very famous one, number 3 on your page. Vayomer Hashem and Avram, Lech Lecha. So we're back at that, Lech Lecha. Rabbi Yitzchak Patach. Rabbi Yitzchak opens up. Shim'i bat, he quotes from the Psalms. Here's a proof text. Nothing to do with Avram. Listen, daughter, and see, v'hati oznech, and incline your ear, pay attention, pay alert attention, v'shikchi amech ubet avich. But forget your people and the house of your father. Now that's a very dramatic address to a young woman in a dramatic situation. Forget everything you come from, but open all your senses towards a future that you don't know. Implicitly, it's very clear from context, that we're talking about a bride who is doing the traditional bride thing of the ancient world, of the world before, pre-modern world, which is leaving home to make a marriage with a man she doesn't know. I'm not talking about a Jewish bride. A Jewish bride has at least to meet her miyuad, her intended, at least once. Yeah. But she's talking about the bride is becoming the emblem now of a condition of anxiety, if you want to call it that, of anxiety in which one has to go and make a difficult journey from one place to another, from the house of the father, move away from that, forget it, towards the house of her husband, whom she doesn't know. And the Midrash quotes that far and stops, breaks. At the end of the Midrash, it's going to return and give what follows. But don't peek. Let's read it as the Midrash gives it. The Midrash now seems to digress. And this is the middle part of the Midrash now. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, this is like, it's a parable of someone, haya over mimakom lemakom, who was traveling from place to place, moving on from place to place, passing. And he saw bira achat doleket. This is the famous Midrash. He saw a big building, a stately building, let's say a castle, doleket. And I'll begin with, there are two meanings, possible meanings of that word, and I'll begin with maybe the pshat, maybe the basic meaning, which is illuminated. He sees a castle with all the windows lit up. And he asks then, he says, Tomar. This is a characteristic Avram question, as the Midrash understands Avram, many Midrashim. He begins his question with the word, would you say? Would you say, in other words, I'm facing two possibilities here. Would you say this when there is that? Would you say that this castle is without someone in charge? Would you say that it doesn't have a Bal Habira, there's no master to the castle? Now, what kind of question is that? If he sees that the castle is illumined, that it's obviously functioning, all parts of it, maybe a little wasteful, but it's functioning. So what kind of question is it when he says, would you say that this is without anyone in charge? It's a rhetorical question. Yeah? It's a rhetorical question in which he perhaps wants to block someone else. He's arguing with something in himself, maybe. And he says, but look at this wonderful world. All right, that's the parable. This castle is the world, and the world is so beautiful and orderly and well organized and so on. So how can you possibly say, would you say? But he asks it in a searching way, not in ridicule. But it's clear what he thinks. What happened then? Hitzitz alav bal habira, the owner of the castle, then peered out at him. Hitzitz. It's a lovely little word. Tzatz. So it's like a sudden moment, the flare of a glance, a gleam of the eye. Suddenly he gets a gleam of God's eye. The owner of the castle just gives him one look and says, Ani bal habira. I'm the owner of the castle. Yeah. On this reading, why is the owner of the castle making an appearance here? This is Lech Lecha. This is the Lech Lecha moment for the Midrash. Lech Lecha, and now it's very loosely connected with a bride who's going on her bridal journey, and with now another parable of the master of the castle. What is the master of the castle doing by appearing in this way, by catching his eye? That's really all it is. Hitzitzelev. At most, perhaps, we can say confirming his intuition, confirming his own sense of reason. Can you say it's without an owner? And God says, still, it's a little humorous, and I don't think humor is always absent from the Midrash by any means. But I wonder about that humor. What is being done? It's a moment of some kind. And so we can turn to the other reading of Doleket. What is this castle? And this you find in very important commentaries on the Midrash. This is how they read it. Doleket doesn't mean illuminated, it means on fire. It's burning up, which is quite a different story. What he observes is that the castle is burning in fire, which means that it's being destroyed, that there's a raging fire there. And he's very disturbed, obviously. And then when he asks the question, would you say that this castle is without anyone in charge? What does it mean now? Would you say that? Anyone? It's happening for no reason. There's a meaninglessness to all this. Yeah. I can only conclude that there's no one in charge, but it's as if what I hear in it is that he has a kind of prejudice. He has a wish to believe there is someone in charge. Obviously, who doesn't want order rather than disorder? And it's as if he's being forced to believe, well, it looks as if there isn't. And he's disturbed by it. Would you say that? And then the owner of the castle peers out at him and says, I'm the owner of the castle. Now, in that case, it's a revelation. God doesn't actually explain anything to him. You might think the point of communicating would be to explain, why is the castle on fire? What does that mean? What does it mean for you? What should you do? Advice, commandment. So all this is Lech Lecha. This is the Midrash, in a way, riffing on the words Lech Lecha. It's the Lech Lecha moment, which is a moment of mystery and deep disturbance in Avram's experience. Traditionally, other sources take this moment of disturbance about the castle on fire as referring to the Tower of Babel, which, the sinful, disordered state of the world that was present at that time, which perturbs Avram deeply. The world is destroying itself yet again. Somewhere a sense of doom, of things falling apart. And Avram himself is deeply disturbed, but God doesn't help him all that much. He doesn't give him information, again, about the world, explaining anything or directing him. It's just a moment of contact, a flare. Now, if you follow the Midrash, you see where it continues. We go back to that verse in Tehillim. V'yitav hamelech yofyech, and the king will desire your beauty. The bride is told here. Right? You have to leave behind everything, open your senses, and the king will desire your beauty, for he is your Lord. Excuse me, ladies. He is your Lord. What is the king will desire your beauty? Suddenly, this young woman is having an indication of a world, a future world, and a future self that has to do with beauty that she didn't know much about beauty, about what the effect of beauty before, and she's going to understand things about the erotic, about desire, and about beauty. She's going to become a different person. Now, because of a future connection that she can't yet fully make real to herself, she's in that transitional moment where she can't really know it in the full sense. But the Midrash continues and retranslates, the king will desire your beauty. Leyapotech ba'olam. The king desires to make you beautiful in the world. Now, that's really quite amazing. What does that mean? In terms of the bride, what does she want to be beautiful in the world? That's not, we're talking here about her relationship with her husband. All right, I can understand that. But as if the larger purposes of the king are not just that he will find her beautiful, but that he will bring out of the bride an intrinsic beauty that will dazzle the world, that will have an effect on the world. Now, here the erotic is becoming a kind of a cosmic force. And Avram is associated with beauty of all things. Now, clearly, it seems to be pretty clear that Avraham, all this is applied to Avram. Now, Avram is the bride, which is a strange thing to say anyway. It's very far from a kind of cognitive, reasonable comparison. This very masculine older man is being compared to a young woman. What is it? It's the unknownness, it's the anxiety, and the promise of an unimaginable life that can perhaps begin to be imagined in the words that are used. V'yitav hamelech yofier. The words convey something, an excitement. But what is this beauty in the world? And you will often find that Avram is identified with characters in the Song of Songs. We'll see it very soon again. The lover or the beloved, the lover in the Song of Songs. He is understood in an erotic context, that we're not just talking about wisdom and lectures about knowledge and debates with people. The intellectual level is, in a way, elided. And what we have is the body, the erotic energy of a person, the connection between people, and the sense that Avram's beauty, as someone said in another class very simply, is that he will be a beautiful person. That is, it's to do with the ensouled body or the embodied soul, whichever way you want to. It's to do with, not necessarily that it has very finely formed limbs. I don't think that's a point. The point is the power of beauty will be his. And beauty is very powerful. It's something the Greeks were not ashamed to talk about. And in our tradition, it seems we are a little modest about it. We don't, on the whole, say a great deal about it, except when it comes to Avraham. For some reason, Midrashim on Avraham talk about beauty. And they mean all other kinds of good things, spirituality and wisdom and so on. But it seems that beauty is the image that has to be used. The effect of beauty and desire, that's how he's going to affect the world. That the world is going to be drawn to him in some real way. So what I'd like to do with you now, this is the core of where we're going. I wouldn't like to say we're going to arrive, because we're not actually going to arrive. Number 6, the Mea Shiloach. The Mea Shiloach, known as the Ishbitzer, end of the 19th century, Hassidic commentary on the Torah, Hassidic master, very influential in a small group of people. God said to Avram, Lech Lecha, me'artzecha. Same, everyone's interested in the Lech Lecha. Begins with a reference to Yeshayahu about pouring water on thirsty ground. And we don't see the relevance so particularly. We're being made to think, if I can just point a little arrow, we're being made to think about a dynamic between, think of water and dryness. Think about the embrace, the erotic movement between water and the active receptive movement of water and dryness. Right, let's just say it that much. Avraham, as soon as Avraham began, when he began to seek and quest after the root of his life, Avraham, on his own accord, had begun to look for the root, R-O-O-T, yes, not the other root, the shorish of his own life. That is, he's not looking for what the prime mover of the universe. He's not looking out there. He's really looking inward. It's not physics, it's metaphysics. And it's really not even metaphysics, actually. He's looking for what makes me me. Why me? Why am I like this? I kind of put it very, very naively. the way every adolescent somewhere feels, and maybe some of us go on feeling for the rest of our lives. Yeah. And you know, other people may have no idea that you ask yourself that question. You know, you seem very well settled in the world, and yet there are certain souls that ask themselves that question: why am I like this? And he's looking, and he realizes, first of all, that things out there in the world, however pleasing and enjoyable, that can't be called life. I can't invest in that as my source of life. That's just a way of being more comfortable in the world. That's very nice to have all these comforts. But it must be something else. And at that point, God appears to him. At that point, God says to him, how does he put it? Lech Lecha, it's 4 lines down, I'm not sure in your text. God says to him, Lech Lecha, Hainu le'atzmacha. Go to yourself. Now, which is the most obvious reading of Lech Lecha, except that we are too sophisticated to read it that way, because we know that it has some kind of metaphoric meaning. No, just simply go into yourself. Lech Lecha. Go look for yourself, for in truth, all the things of this world really can't be called life, and the main essence of life you will find, and what do you expect God to say? You will find in me. Go and seek me. Instead, the Midrashic has it, you will find in yourself. In your consciousness, in the strange way you are inside, in the oddity and the perturbation of your being. Can I use the word perturbation? I just adopted it this week. In my experience, it's not a word I often use. I don't even think I read it very much. But suddenly it came to life. Perturbation. What's at the root of it? A turbo. All right. It's a storm. It's confused power. It's power that's not necessarily linear and knowing what it's doing. Perturbation is confusion. And there he is, and God says, look into yourself. Atata gil b'Hashem. You will, quotations here also from Yeshayahu, that you will find that root of life in yourself. What happens here with the owner of the castle? He asks, who is the owner of the castle? And then God peers out a love. And he makes a great deal of that word, alav. Not a love. He doesn't look out at him, which that would be the usual expression. He looks upon him, as if to say, look at yourself. You know, it's like where you point. No, take that out. He says, don't look outwards. I'm looking at you. I'm looking at you. You are the object of fascination here. What is so fascinating about you? You should be awestruck at what goes on in a human being's unconscious, conscious and unconscious. It's a whole consciousness. And what goes on in there, the trouble and the quest and the perturbation, that is awe-inspiring. There's something about the inner human world that you should appreciate. And the way it's put in the text is that Avram is brought to feel that he is strangely different from other people, that only he is troubled by the sight of the burning castle, and no one else seems to be troubled. Everyone lives in the course of the world, gets up and goes to bed and eats meals and lives. That's at least what he feels. I'm the only one in all the history of, no one has ever been troubled as I am. And my trouble is not a pleasant thing. It's not a romantic thing. There's a lot of anxiety about it. The world is wrong in some way. And I take it very personally. And God says admiringly, in a way, just look at you. Look at you. Your question, you are stormy, ro'esh. You are full of storm. You have ra'am in you. Hirim. What creates that storm in you? That's me. And the Ishbitzer goes very far with this. I mean, if you read the text very closely, you'll see that what he's saying is not just that I am arousing you. He does put it that way. I am arousing you to these questions. Where do these questions come from that you have about the world? They come from me. He actually presses it a little further than that, dangerously a little further, to say something like, that state of mind that you're in, that's where I am. That is a theological condition you're in. That's a condition, it's a moment that you're living. It's a moment, an important moment where there is God, if anywhere. That, don't look outwards, look inwards. And I'd suggest that one thing one might conclude from this is that the questioning voice in Avram, the voice that is not satisfied with the world, is disturbed by the disorder and the incoherence of the world. And goodness, there's something to be disturbed by. It's not hard to be disturbed. That in itself is ani. That is ani bal habira. That is, your trouble is not just evidence of God. It's actually, that's where God is. So it gets dangerously close to some things that perhaps can't be said, but his student, the student of the Meir Shiloach, Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, takes this considerably further. And I didn't put it on your page because we have enough to deal with here for the time being. Now, this is self-consciousness. This is reflectiveness. This is what's the word I want? It's the obvious word? Introspection. Thank you. Introspection. Introspection as a place where you will find the answer, if there is an answer. But it won't be found anywhere else but in the place of wandering and trouble and incoherence. You can't calm that down and then hope to find an answer. That somewhere it's right there. And that's not a simple idea. There's an otherness. Can I say it like that? That Avram becomes aware of an otherness in himself. What asks the questions? It's a voice in himself that he didn't know he had. It really comes up, call it from the unconscious or from God, from the root of his being. And it asks the question. Right? So there's an inner otherness, which is different. What most people seem to live more on the surface, more in harmony with themselves, if you want to put it like that. And here you have someone, and he will represent the Jewish people in that sense. His children will be those who are troubled by what doesn't seem to trouble other people, who are in a way sore thumbs, who are oversensitive in some sense. If we have a look now at the next midrash, we move on with the imagery. Another quite unexpected image. Yes. Number 7. Vayomer Hashem el Avram. We're still talking about the Lech Lecha moment. Rabbi Brachia opened up and began, and he quotes this time from the Song of Songs. In other words, proof texts are brought from quite different places, not the story of Abraham at all, and somehow attached to, combined with our story. It's a poetic process, evocative process. There's something about the reference to your father's house, leave your father's house, that reminds the Midrash, the Baal HaMidrash, of that other verse about leaving your father, forget your father's house. Right? Because of that, I can bring the two together. Here, it's, how is it put here? The verse from the Song of Songs goes like this. I'll read it in English. Your ointments yield a sweet fragrance. Your name is like finest oil. This is a description in the Song of Songs of the beauty and the evocative fragrance of the lover. It's her praise of her beloved, that you have most beautiful perfume around you. And that, the Midrash says, is like Avraham. What is like Avraham here? Rabbi Brachia says, why was Avram our father compared to a flask of apofil simon? Apofil simon. I had to practice that. You look it up. Apofil simon is the oil of a balsam tree, which apparently in those times was much in demand among rich people who could afford it, to daub their houses in. They would put oil their houses in it, and it apparently gave a beautiful, a rich fragrance, as it were. It told people who you are, if you could afford to buy this special. So here there's a flask of a pils. I would like to just translate it perfume, something that smells good. And I just have to be truthful, to say it doesn't seem to be exactly personal perfume, but something slightly different. But nevertheless, precious oils. Precious oils. Okay. Avram is compared to precious oils. So here you have a flask of precious oils, tightly corked and laid in a corner. Velo haya recho nodef, so that its perfume didn't diffuse, didn't actually move out in the world. So there it is. It's called perfume, but it's not doing perfume. It's not acting like perfume because it's all totally closed, and it's stable. It's in one place, it's wedged into a corner, so it's not doing anything. Open it up and wave it around. Taltel. When you take it, that interesting word, taltel now. Taltel is to agitate something, to throw it into confusion, in a way. Wave it around, and then its perfume wafts out into the world. That's how you get it moving in the world, and that's how it comes to affect the world. So what is the analogy? It's really what we call a conceit. It's a certain kind of slightly forced image, which actually is very effective, if you can let yourself go with it. Tzarich lizrom, right? Isn't that what the Israelis say? You have to go with it. So what is it here? Avram is someone who has to taltel atzmacha. That when God says to Avram, Lech Lecha, get going, he is telling him taltel atzmacha. It's a wonderful play of words. It's a kind of echo. Taltel, Lech Lech. It's like a kind of Lech Lech becomes a kind of agitated expression. Just let go of your control. Let go of your mastery. Let go of your old self. And taltel is agitate yourself. Now, this again, talking of anxiety, tiltul has mostly negative connotations. If you look it up, it can mean just to be carried around, taltalim, metaltalim. But the meanings are, I looked it up, it can mean to be harassed, mitultal, it can mean to be distracted, not to be off a clear sense of meaning, to be off somewhere that's not going anywhere. It can mean to be suffering from road fatigue, that's quite appropriate. And it is one of the things that security services do to prisoners who are moderately tortured. Yeah. It's called tiltul, thrown around. Now, that's what God tells Avram to do to himself. Yeah. By telling you Lech Lecha, I'm telling you to loosen control. In a way to let something happen that will release your fragrance into the world. And what is fragrance if not a kind of secret? It's a secret of the self. Right? It's not something I wear concretely on me and say, look who I am. It's evocative. It's a way of implying something. It's a hint. Someone who's wearing perfume. It's a hint of worlds that are not the concrete, everyday world, of erotic worlds, if you want to put it like that, of worlds of imagination or worlds of spirituality. You can be an evocative force in the world. And that's a very flat translation. And that's what it means to be perfume, to do perfume. The way you will affect the world will be because of your agitation. That is, not because you are a calm, perfectly harmonious person, but really the opposite. That you are someone who has traveled and is still traveling. You are someone who is not so sure of where he's going. Now, that means that we're not talking only about trouble here. It's not only a painful situation, the tiltul. It does have rewards. And the rewards are a sense of really affecting the world. That that people will be drawn to you not because of your brilliant arguments so much, as simply by a quality of your being. I could say very simply by your style, but I mean style in a very serious way. One's style of being, how one is, not what qualifications one has. Now, that is very evocative. And here I'd like to bring in the idea very briefly of hints, of what one can get from just a whiff of perfume, what one can get from a hint. I have a little lineup here of three great people: Keats, John Keats, Henry James, the novelist, and Wittgenstein, the great philosopher, rather different from each other, all of whom use the word hints when they're talking about how they function creatively in the world. How do they work? Wittgenstein, for instance, is asked by a fellow philosopher, "Have you read much Kierkegaard?" And he answers, let me read it. He answers, I will be carrying on till 9:10 because we started 10 minutes late. And if you have to leave, you have to leave. So here is Wittgenstein, who says this: "He could not read him much. He got hints. He did not want another man's thought all chewed." Kierkegaard has worked it out for himself. I don't want that. Someone else's thought all processed. A word or two was sometimes enough. I can hear a word of, sometimes one does this, don't you? I do it sometimes. I open a book and I read in a way like poetry. I just look at a sentence and I just, that's enough. It begins to stir me up. Something is evoked there. And I begin to think. The whole aim then of the exercise is to have an inner world, to awaken an inner world and then to produce from it, to create something. The aim is not to stuff oneself with material from outside. Now, of course, there are other reasons for reading whole books rather than one sentence. I'm not completely rejecting that possibility. But this is a particular form of evocation and of creative contact. What do you get from if you want to create? Keats very similarly talks about, and again I'll just read a sentence from a famous letter. He says this: "Now it appears to me that almost any man may, like the spider, spin from his own innards his own airy citadel." Right? Just thin gossamer threads. His whole becomes a whole castle. Talking of castles. The points of leaves and twigs on which the spider begins her work are few. Right? The spider doesn't look for solid ground to attach its. Right? It's just a point here, a point there, a point. That's all it takes. A hint, something to hold on to here and there, and suddenly you have this. Something is produced from inside, from the inner world, and that, as I say, she fills the air with a beautiful circuiting. Man should be content with as few points to tip with the fine web of his soul and weave a tapestry, and so on. Again, another short sentence. "It seems to me we should rather be the flower than the bee. For it is a false notion that more is gained by receiving than giving. No, the receiver and the giver are equal in their benefits. The flower, I doubt not, receives a fair guerdon from the bee." All right. "Who shall say between man and woman which is the most delighted? Let us not therefore go hurrying about and collecting honey bee-like, buzzing here and there impatiently from a knowledge of what is to be arrived at. But let us open our leaves like a flower and be passive and receptive, budding patiently and so on, and taking hints from every noble insect and so on." Very beautiful passage, meaning receptivity. What is a person with an active inner world? It's someone who is sensitive and responsive to very little. Sometimes it can be very little, and you can make a lot of very little. Now, that idea, I think, is there in both these Midrashim. And now I didn't tell you Henry James, but it's very similar. Henry James gets the subject of his next novel from a little story he hears at a dinner table. And because he's listening with a certain radar for affinity, for something that will speak to him. Now, I bring this back now. Did God Choose Avram. That's what the sages say. For a wise person, a hint is enough. Talking about hints. It's quite sufficient. That's all you need, a hint. So what is with Avraham? Avram is someone who affects the world by very little, who affects the world not by something that appears in a way minor. It appears, and it has to do with the impact of his being, with his whole being in agitation. And then, number 8, Lecha tal yaldutecha. We're still on Lech Lecha. What is Lecha? Go to yourself. And so there's a play here on words. Lecha, where do you find another Lecha? So you have this quotation, I don't remember where from. Lecha tal yaldutecha. Your youth is for you like dew. What an image. It acts like dew to you. Because when Avraham, our father, right, again, applied straight to Avraham, he was anxious, mitpached, and he said, would you say that there is in my hand sin? In other words, am I still full of sin? Do I have sin inside me? Because of those early years when I worshipped idols. Now that is the censorable early years of Avraham. That was Gnai. That was the bad news about Avram's life, that he did begin as an idol worshipper. And he's worried about it now because he says, maybe once an idol worshipper, in some sense it's still there inside me. He's worried, would you say that that's how we begin the Seder? Yes? There are two things, one about Avraham and one about the whole nation, that we began as idolaters. And I'm suggesting now that we don't say that just in honesty. Let's put it all on the table. That we really we're told to start that way. Right? Because I'll say the story of Yetziah, of the Exodus, begins with Gnai. It begins with the confused stuff, the stuff of not knowing and not finding and not knowing how to put it together. It begins with that, and it ends with excellence. That's the way it has to go. You can't tell the story in any other way. Rav Hudner says it very strongly. He says, you always begin with a question. That any form of knowledge begins with a question, and he doesn't only mean an intellectual question. When he says a kushia, he means a real sense of the night and not the day. Yes, the sense of darkness and not of daylight. That it's from that knowledge grows. And it doesn't mean that one leaves the dark ever behind one forever after that. Then there's another night afterwards. In other words, in order to be fertile, in order to diffuse perfume, in order to connect with people in this kind of way, one has to really know the creative power of the question. That the question itself is the creative thing. And he actually says very often a good answer is more in need of a question than a good question is in need of an answer. If you see what, yeah? That answers that offer themselves to you without a question it's like being stuffed with too much Kierkegaard. In other words, it's just, what do I have to do with this? Yeah. It has to be personal. It has to be intimate. L'chavev. It has to be chaviv to you. It has to be, okay. So if we finish looking at this passage here, Avram is worried, and God answers him, Lecha tal yaldutecha. Your youth is due to you. It's a mysterious statement. Just as this dew diffuses, that is, it's there, a few pearls on the grass. It's the most moisture there, and then you look again, and it's gone. It's gone. It disappears. It diffuses. So your sins are there and then disappear. They've gone. Is that comforting? Why not have them there altogether? Wouldn't that be even better? What does it mean it disappears? So it's gone? Is that all we can say? Just as the dew is a sign of blessing to the world, here it sharpens. So your sins are a sign of blessing to the world. Now that's quite strong. Yeah. In your case, sin had a evocative effect on you. That's what got you searching. That's what made you realize the fire of the world. You began to really be impacted because you were exposed in some way. Now, that ultra-sensitivity of Avraham is both the unbearable thing, and the essential thing in producing what comes later. I want to move towards finishing with the wonderful commentary of the Shem Mishmuel in number 10 on this Midrash. Shem Mishmuel was another of the Hassidic masters of the late 19th century. And he says, I have to understand this image of the dew. What does dew have to do with things here? Why is that Avraham? And he quotes from a passage in the Talmud, which you can see in number 9, but sufficiently the information is here. Israel prayed for God to come to them like rain. And God corrected them and said, I have a better wish for you. Really, you should pray for God to come to you like dew. And so the Shem Mishmuel asks, why? In what way is dew better than rain? There are obvious ways in which rain is better than dew. No? And this is how he puts it. The rain is too much there. It comes from the outside and it's there. It comes, look at how he puts it. Geshem Lech Lecha et haaretz. The rain moistens the ground and stays there. That's what's good about it. It makes the ground moist and it lasts. And God then answered the people and said, but in that case, this moisture will not be machmat atzmam, will not come from the innermost, their own inner selves. That is, it will come from the outside and irrigate things, but then the blessing will be from the outside. And it won't connect on a very intimate level with something inward. Whereas dew comes, and he has a way of describing the science of dew here. He says the dew, what it does is it arouses the inner freshness, the inner moisture of the grass, which is certainly, it's a way of imagining a dynamic, that the dew is there, and what it does is arouse air. It arouses the inner resources of the grass. The grass has some moisture in it, but it's not coming out. When the dew is there, it just wakes it up. Right? It's a poetic rather than a scientific description. And then it can disappear. We don't need that external catalyst anymore, because you from yourself are now producing the life, what needs to happen. Now with this, the reference to Avram's sins is that his sins, in his case, have acted like this. That they were there and they did something to him that turned out to be wish to be like dew and not like rain. There is a story about an Australian discovery of something that's called petrichor. An Australian researcher investigated this strange phenomenon that in Australia, after a long dry season, parched ground, just before the rains fell, a strange smell filled the air. And everyone noticed it, the animals noticed it, everyone noticed it. They made perfume when they identified it as an oil that comes out from the stones, petrichor, like the divine blood of the stone. What happens scientifically is, and that was the fruit of this research, I think it was about the 1980s, this research was done. There's films you can look up on YouTube of how it works. That the first moisture, when the first almost invisible moisture falls on the ground, what it does is go into the pores of the ground, of the stone, and brings out that oil that's inside, and it comes out in gushes, in little spurts, like an aerosol. Wow. And you can see films, not of it, but of how it's imagined, images of how they imagine it happens. It comes out, and that's what affects the air and the perfume, and the sense while you're still in the transitional state, of already an awakening. There's an awakening happening before you actually have the rain. You have the cause of the change. What you have here then, I'm going to finish with this then, is an Avraham who, let me just say something from the text of this parasha, who says to God at a certain moment in the middle of the parasha, God says to him, I will protect you. This is after the battles with the kings. God says, don't worry, don't be afraid. I will protect you and I'll give you great reward. Making promises. And Avram says, Ma titenli. A rather aggressive response to God's promises. What are you going to give me? Va'anochi holech ariri. What are you going to give me if I go ariri? Which is a very unusual word. I don't think it ever occurs again in that form. But the root does occur again. Air. And you look at Rashi. Means without children, right? I go without children. And here Rashi is, Avram is being quite aggressive. He's saying, thank you for all the blessings, but children. You know, the fact is, I'm without children. And meantime, it looks as if my servant is going to inherit me. And God doesn't answer. So it's as if God is breaking off communication. And up to now, no human being really initiated communication with God. But Avram has that inner world. He has that inner power. And he persists. He persists with God. And he goes on and says again, you know, look, you have given me. He presses. He takes a risk with God. And God does answer him that time. And then he presses again. But how shall I know that I'll inherit the land? Right? In other words, it's his own initiative that keeps coming out at this stage of his development. And there, even the rabbis are a little critical of him and say, Hifriz b'midatov shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that in some way he's taking advantage of God's patience. He's pushing a bit too far here. But the fact is that we have to notice this, that Avram is someone who has an autonomous life, that he is in some kind of dialogue with God, which he initiates. But what about that word ariri? I have 2 minutes, I want to finish with this. It's a strangely paradoxical word. On the one hand, it means, all you have to do is look at Rashi on the word and follow up his references. He says, on the one hand, it means to expose the roots, the foundations of a building. That is, to raise with a R-A-S-E, Z-E, to destroy a building to the roots, to the foundations, to expose the foundations. So it's an image of destruction. It's an image of loss of all form and clear meaning and so on. And on the other hand, it's libi er. My heart is awake. Yeah, Song of Songs. I am asleep, but my heart is awake. Er is a state of ultra alertness. It's a state when you're exposed, right? When you are not well covered up in the structures of things, then you have a kind of intense, exposed life. There's a kind of life that is not easy to live. It's not an easy form of life. But, and Rashi quotes this too, he refers to it too, in the book of Malachi, what is the ideal state of Jewish culture? It's a state of what's called er v'oneh. Er v'oneh, which is understood by the sages, by Rashi and the Midrash, as what you need is someone who is alert, alert to incoherence, to difficulty, to trouble, to disorder, to questions, and has good questions to ask, and asks good questions, and then you need an oneh. You need another voice that's there to answer the questions. So in a teacher-student situation, you need good students, and you need a good teacher. But this is clearly more inward. Now, Avram in himself is someone who is both highly sensitive, exposed in some way that makes him very alert to hints, and able to make something of them. That is, he's able to answer in some way his own otherness. He's able to make connection with his own unconscious, if you want to the possibility of integration, which can happen only if one knows about disintegration. That's the uncheering, right? It's not exactly a happy ending to the story, because of this perturbation, as if perturbation is somewhere close to the root of things, and has to be exposed sometimes. Sometimes that root. I actually had a root canal treatment this week, and of course that's how things go, and it led me to great thoughts as I was squirming around about roots. You know, there's something painful about exposed roots, no doubt about that. On the other hand, childlessness, not being rooted in the world. But that's where Avram comes from. And that's what makes him, in the end, Avraham. Av Hamon Goyim. A father not just of one nation biologically, but spiritually. Someone who made contact and created a creative relationship with other nations. I think it is time to stop. Did someone do that deliberately? Thank you. Thank you.